All right, folks are still filtering in, but we're getting pretty close to capacity here, so let's get going. You are at ACR's Improved Forest Management on Non-Federal U.S. Forest Lands version 2.1 webinar, and we're so happy to have you here today. We are recording this session, so we will be sharing the recording. So if you have colleagues or others who can't be here now, we'll be sharing this. We also will be taking questions throughout. You can use the Q&A feature on the Zoom platform to submit questions. We've already received quite a few questions as part of the registration process, which will start when we get to Q&A. We'll start with those and then take whatever we can in the remaining time. We're also going to develop a blog post to try to address the most common or key questions in follow-up. So we're trying to get the information out there in a variety of ways. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Mary Grady, Executive Director of ACR. Mary, over to you.
Thanks, Brad, and welcome everybody to our webinar today. Worldwide, there are 5 billion acres of managed forests. The U.S. and Canada make up over 25% of that total, with more than 700 million acres and 575 million acres of managed forests, respectively. Improved forest management offers a huge opportunity to meet the multiple needs of stabilizing the climate and enhancing the economic, ecosystem service, and biodiversity values that forests provide. Said differently, there's no solving the climate crisis without protecting and restoring managed forests. As the leading carbon crediting program for North America, with improved forest management projects covering 8 million acres of forest land, ACR takes this responsibility very seriously. Since we introduced our first IFM methodology in 2010, we have released 7 updates to incorporate our experience and leverage the availability of new technology. I'm really proud of the work that's been done by our team in this version 2.1, which was released in July. We're really thrilled by the level of interest in this version 2.1 with so many people joining us today, and we appreciate your taking the time to better understand our approach. We're only going to be successful at scaling our impact if we have an approach to crediting for IFM that's both workable for multiple categories of landowners and robust as required by the market. We look forward to working with you in the months ahead to achieve that climate impact. Thanks.
And with that, we'll turn it over to Dr. Kurt Krapfel, head of the ACR Forestry program.
Thanks, Brad. Would you mind going to the next slide, please? Thanks everyone for being here today. It is really great to see so many folks interested in our methodology. Thank you, Mary, for the excellent overview of IFM and our program. Yeah, there's been we've seen a tremendous amount of interest in this new version of the IFM methodology, and we're really proud of the work that our team's done to continually improve our methodology over time and keep it top notch in the market. As Mary said, our IFM methodology was first developed in 2010, has since undergone 7 updates throughout the years. So this is the latest iteration of a already workable and proven methodology that delivers high quality climate impact. We have over 8 million acres of forest land currently listed and enrolled in the U.S. and Canada in this methodology across over 200 projects. So the methodology is what we consider to be a systematic and objective framework for quantifying the climate benefits of IFM project activities, which is primarily growing trees longer and growing trees larger and storing more carbon than would be achieved in the absence of the financial incentive of the carbon revenue. ACR's approach guides project proponents in developing a plausible and likely management scenario that would occur in the absence of the project, considering ownership characteristics, constraints to baseline forest management, such as legal restrictions, operability, timber market capacity, regional silviculture, localized harvest intensity, and more. The baseline is then developed through a financial analysis that considers all relevant constraints guiding baseline harvest decisions over time. And as conditions relevant to forest management change, ACR's new dynamic baseline evaluation framework guides project proponents in adapting their baseline to reflect those changing conditions over time. So IFM version 2.1 is now required for all new projects since July of this year. And we're also developing an optional tool to implement components of the IFM 2.1 approach for projects that are developed under older versions of the methodology as well. Next slide, please. So what's important to take away today is that this is fundamentally the same workable approach that's applied to forests across the United States and Canada, with additional requirements for
lost
rigor.
your audio.
Oh, really? Is that better?
No, I didn't lose his audio.
Okay. Okay. Again, this is the same workable approach that's been applied to forest across the United States and Canada, but we have introduced some increased requirements for rigor and precision. The updated IFM methodology meets market expectations for quality through enhanced requirements for rigor and precision. And while carbon credit buyers demand high integrity, we recognize that landowners and investors also require practicality and predictability to sign multi-decadal commitments that encumber their lands. So ACR's approach balances these interests in a workable and proven framework, because ultimately a carbon crediting methodology only is impactful if it's used, and therefore requirements need to be both practical and precise. Next slide, please. The key innovations in the version 2.1 of the ACR IFM methodology are primarily related to baseline setting. And we've developed what we call a project-specific dynamic evaluation framework. So project-specific emphasizes our boots on the ground approach to observing and incorporating conditions that are specific to the property into the baseline. Our new harvest intensity component of baseline setting ultimately governs the amount of wood that can be harvested from a property over time, or in other words, the aggressiveness of the baseline. This considers management intent of the landowner, physical conditions of the property, market conditions, and more. The dynamic baseline component is implemented as a regularly updated baseline that reflects changing conditions over time. Essentially, the baseline changes as necessary on the basis of observed conditions relevant to baseline forest management and over a specific reporting period being credited. We implement this as a practical checklist that assesses key parameters relevant to baseline forest management at each verification leading to issuance. And importantly, these are all verified ex post prior to each credit issuance. Next slide, please. So digging in a little bit more, project-specific means a precise and conservative baseline such that credits are only credited for harvest or are only awarded for harvests that would very likely occur in the absence of the project. In order to do this, we need a robust forest inventory that sends people out on the ground, collects data to summarize the forest resource, to observe and to understand the site conditions and ownership structure as relevant to the baseline forest management. People are out there, project developers collect site-specific data related to the legal, physical, and financial constraints to forest management of a given site. These might include specific costs related to the logistics of the baseline harvest regime, like operability and access, timber merchantability, mill capacity, existing easements or restrictions to harvesting, and more. The baseline is then set in consideration of landowner intent, regional silviculture as substantiated by a professional forester, and harvest intensity, which again, we'll get into a little bit more, but ultimately affects the amount of harvest that can occur in the baseline over time. Next slide, please. And the second part of the project-specific dynamic baseline is, of course, the dynamic baseline itself. This is a baseline that's regularly evaluated and updated over time, reflecting changing conditions relevant to the baseline forest management. Carbon credit buyers and market participants have signaled a desire for more frequently updated baselines, and we think that the ACR dynamic baseline evaluation framework balances the need for certainty to attract upfront investment with the flexibility necessary to modify the baseline when conditions change. This is implemented as a practical checklist where key baseline setting parameters are evaluated ex ante and verified ex post prior to each credit issuance. And our new tool for dynamic evaluation of baseline establishes this as an objective and verifiable framework for conducting baseline reevaluations. Again, a methodology is only useful if it's used, so it needs to work for both buyers and landowners. And under our existing framework, a complete reassessment of the baseline scenario and model projections occurs at each verification leading to credit issuance on a maximum 5-year cycle, although it can happen sooner, more frequently. With that, I'll pass it to my colleague, Andy Taylor. He had a large part in developing this methodology as well, and he'll get into more of the specifics.
Okay, thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Mary and Brad. Again, my name is Andy Taylor. I'm a Senior Technical Manager of Forestry here at ACR, and I'm so glad that you're all joining us today. So we're going to dive into the details of some of the key innovations in the updated version of the methodology for setting a precise and conservative baseline. So just as always, the first step to set a baseline is to conduct a forest inventory. So foresters utilize statistical sampling methods to physically measure trees across the property while meeting requirements for uncertainty and taking deductions as necessary. This data is summarized to establish initial carbon stocks. Next, the project seeks out the input of a professional forester to attest to common practice silvicultural prescriptions that are appropriate for the project area. This includes the type of harvest that should take place, such as clear cutting or shelter woods or single tree selection, but not necessarily the total volume extracted. Next, a conservative harvest schedule is set while considering all constraints. This step determines whether baseline stocking is over time growing, shrinking, or staying roughly the same as initial carbon stocks. Each constraint that impacts the harvest schedule is thoroughly substantiated with public-facing documentation. And the updated methodology adds new language to clarify the previously existing constraints such that they're more verifiable than in previous versions. Notably, and as already mentioned, the updated version also introduces harvest intensity as a new constraint. And lastly, as an ongoing process throughout the project term, the baseline is dynamically evaluated. This is a continuous assessment of all key parameters that could affect the baseline scenario. So if a new constraint is introduced, such as a new law or a recent mill closure, it needs to be incorporated prior to issuing any new credits. Next slide, please. Okay, we're going to explore the harvest intensity constraints a little further. This is an allowable upper limit on harvest over time and space, which must be respected in that baseline harvest schedule. It's expressed in percent biomass removed per acre multiplied by the percent area harvested per year. And this specific formulation allows comparison across different types of harvests, or different harvest types. For instance, a clear cut, which might have a high percentage biomass removed per acre over a smaller area, could have a similar or even equal harvest intensity to a partial harvest or thin over a larger area. So this flexibility is key for projects to model different types of silviculture that are realistic for their given property. This new constraint was introduced to capture certain variables that are hard to directly measure, but may impact the likelihood of baseline harvest occurring, such as landowner intent and macroeconomic conditions. Next slide. Okay. Projects can determine harvest intensity using 3 different pathways. First is doing a comparable properties analysis using a standalone tool that was just developed and published simultaneously as IFM 2.1, which guides the process. Second, you can derive a harvest intensity constraint from a qualified pre-existing forest management plan. Or third, modeling a removals only baseline. So we'll go on to discuss each of these 3 options. Next slide. So the tool for comparable properties analysis prescribes a step-by-step process for calculating a harvest intensity constraint based on a geospatial analysis that identifies recent harvests on similar properties in the region. The first step is to identify eligible comparable properties using some basic criteria. This includes size relative to the project area, ecological region, proximity to the project, and ownership characteristics. And that last criterion, ownership characteristics, is really important because that provides us insights about landowner intent by comparing to other forest landowners with similar ownership structures. For instance, private industrial projects will only compare to other private industrial owners, while public projects compare to other public landowners, and land trusts compare to other nonprofit landowners, and so on and so forth. So then all the eligible comparable properties are ranked according to their similarity to the project area. Similarity is calculated using Euclidean distance based on a number of criteria, including size, distance to the project, topographic characteristics, biomass density, the mix of forest types, and distribution of merchantability characteristics. Merchantability is really important because you can imagine that a comparable property with exclusively mature merchantable timber could be managed very differently than a carbon project with no harvestable or merchantable timber, or vice versa. Since we can't directly measure stand age or tree diameter with publicly available remote sensing products, we utilize tree height as a proxy for merchantability. Next slide, please. So the 8 most similar properties are then subjected to an outlier detection test. And any property that harvests at a far greater rate than the others is ineligible and thrown out. Of the remaining properties, the project chooses one to use for stratum-specific constraint development. ACR has also published a companion calculator to demonstrate the eligibility calculations, the similarity calculations, the outlier detection test, and lastly, the calculation of harvest intensity constraints using an example project. And this calculator can be found on our website. The result of all this is that baselines are justified with remotely sensed evidence of recent harvests on nearby properties, and these properties resemble the project property. In this example map, you can see the project area in black outline, and then you can see all the matched comparable properties in blue outline, which are relatively similar in size, geographically close by. And one of those matched properties was then selected for constraint development, and that's the property highlighted in lime green there. Next slide, please. So you may be asking yourself whether ACR developed a novel approach with remote sensing to determine harvest rates across the landscape. And the answer is no. We leveraged many existing data sets as to not reinvent the wheel, and we simply provided a framework for combining them and analyzing the results. The remote sensing data sets that are utilized were, in almost all cases, available to the general public for free. As always, we try to not pick winners and losers and choose individual private companies whose data sets can be used while excluding others. We instead relied on data sets from public agencies, and in case of the Global Land Analysis and Discovery, a public university that's from the University of Maryland. There are a few notable exceptions where it was necessary, but this was a guiding principle for us. We also provided a pathway for project developers to validate their own or just different harvest identification layers or forest loss layers, either developed internally by the project developers themselves or from a third-party company or from other research and academic organizations. The bar for utilizing different forest loss layers is intentionally really high. So if a project intends to use a data set other than the defaults prescribed by the tool, they must demonstrate that for that individual project, the proposed data set outperforms the default data sets in terms of precision. So that's in terms of harvest identification, specifically not identifying harvests that didn't actually occur. So while the bar may seem really high right now, this validation test positions ACR and this tool for the future. By prescribing a pathway for validating other remote sensing data sets, we hope to incentivize the development of new technologies that identify harvests more accurately and more affordably. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on from comparable properties analysis to another option for setting a baseline harvest intensity constraint, the pre-existing forest management plan. These plans are good indicators of forest management in the absence of the project, with a couple of qualifications. They must be prepared by a professional forester operating in the region. They must fully encompass the project area. And probably most importantly, they must be prepared more than 3 years prior to the project start date. And this ensures that they weren't developed exclusively for the purpose of setting a favorable baseline. They also can't be prepared more than 10 years before the project start date. So that ensures that they're still recent enough to be relevant to baseline setting. We think this 3 to 10 year window strikes the right balance. Lastly, a forest management plan must contain explicit recommendations for deriving harvest intensity constraint, whether that's area harvested per year or volume harvested per year. Next slide, please. The final option for determining harvest intensity is to utilize a removals only baseline. Projects develop a fully constrained project-specific harvest schedule and then evaluate the resulting long-term average stocking level relative to the project's initial stocking levels. If the long-term average stocking equals or exceeds, is greater than the initial stocking levels, then the modeled harvest schedule is used as is to set stocking throughout the project term. But if the long-term average is less than initial stocking levels, then stocking levels throughout the project term are conservatively set to equal initial stocking. This effectively prevents the issuance of emission reductions for projects pursuing this path. It also provides a less arduous option for projects that modestly assert that the baseline scenario would harvest equal to or less than growth. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on from harvest intensity to the dynamic evaluation portion. The improved forest management version 2.1 projects are required to use a standalone tool to facilitate the dynamic evaluation process. As Kurt mentioned, this is structured as a practical checklist, and the checklist is based on the constraint categories that projects use to set their initial baseline. These categories include legal constraints, operability and access, market capacity like mill capacity, financial feasibility, and forest management practices. For projects employing a comparable properties analysis to set their harvest intensity, the forest management practices category requires ongoing comparable properties analyses. Next slide, please. The dynamic evaluation consists of two processes. They're iterative and they're applied repeatedly throughout the project term. The first is what we call the observed conditions assessment. This is applied every reporting period, including both desk and full verifications. And it's a process that makes sure that the most recent ex-ante projections are still matching what was observed to have actually occurred during the reporting period. To actually conduct this assessment, a project applies that practical checklist that evaluates all those constraint categories from the previous slide. And if any discrepancies are discovered, the project is required to make adjustments to the carbon accounting prior to credit issuance. Verifiers will check the results of this assessment and any adjustments to the carbon accounting to make sure they agree with the results. The second process is the periodic modeling assessment. This is conducted every 5 years or coincident with each full verification that includes a site visit. The process incorporates all adjustments that may have been discovered by recent observed conditions assessments, and it generates fresh ex-ante projections for the project on a forward-moving basis. These new ex-ante projections are then used by upcoming observed conditions assessments. The purpose of the periodic modeling assessment is just to periodically align ex-ante projections with recent observations, and this facilitates easier ex-post adjustments. That way, your ex-post adjustments aren't forever based off the assumptions that were made at the project start date. Critically, the new methodology doesn't just require more frequent forecasting. It really does require a look back on what actually occurred during the reporting period. And if the baseline projections turned out to be inaccurate, adjustments are required before credits can be issued again. Next slide. So just to summarize, the recent methodology updates build off ACR's existing successful IFM program. And because we didn't reinvent the wheel, we're confident it can work well at scale across North America, and that it meets market demands for high-quality IFM projects. The harvest intensity constraint adds a ground truthing element to all baseline harvest claims. So if you can't prove other similar landowners are harvesting as intensely as the baseline, then you need to tone it down and bring it into alignment with harvests observed on the landscape. ACR IFM baselines will be dynamically evaluated through time, ensuring that all key assumptions are vetted prior to any credit issuance. The framework for performing the dynamic evaluation is a practical checklist that we hope provides the correct amount of certainty to landowners and investors. Next slide. And I'd like to just take a moment to remember why we're all here to discuss the intricacies of an improved forest management methodology today. everybody on the line, I'm sure, is deeply concerned with climate change and achieving the goals set by the Paris Agreement. And carbon markets have an important yet unrealized role to play. To grow carbon markets to meet their potential, we need to inspire confidence with buyers by developing high-quality projects. And we also need to gain the trust of landowners and project developers by providing a workable approach with sufficient certainty about their investment. And with that, I think we're ready to move on to questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Andy. We're going to start with the questions we received during the registration. There's quite a few also rolling in right now. I think we'll do our best to cover as much as possible. So first question, Kurt, can you expand on the dynamic baseline in terms of how it meets market expectations for quality? And what aspects of the baseline must be evaluated over time?
Yeah, definitely. Important question. The IFM market has been coalescing around a desire for baselines which are periodically and regularly updated. And the ACR IFM dynamic baseline was built with this in mind. It's updated over time on the basis of observable, clearly defined parameters that affect the feasibility and likelihood of the proposed baseline. So how it works is that at each verification, the baseline needs to be assessed against new legal restrictions, changes in the site operability and access for logging, changes in regional timber market capacity, changes in regional forest management practices, such as silviculture and harvest intensities, and financial feasibility as well. So it incorporates changes in pricing and market conditions that would make previously planned harvesting in the baseline infeasible, would also be looked at and adjusted as necessary. So again, the approach, we think that by examining key parameters relevant to the baseline over time, we're striking the appropriate balance between a rigorously updated baseline that reflects changing conditions, but still providing an appropriate degree of certainty to our stakeholders so that they can invest and implement in carbon projects. And I think so notably, our approach leverages remote sensing techniques to help us understand land management that's occurring on the landscape in the absence of carbon revenue, and using that as a constraint for our standardized NPV approach that's been successfully used by a lot of projects already to date. But now we're also including that dynamic update over time as based on key conditions that change.
Thanks, Kurt. Andy, can you tell us more about the level of decision points allowed for in the methodology? How is replicability ensured and subjectivity minimized?
Sure. Well, the methodology does allow for certain well-defined optionality for the purpose of practicality and project specificity, while minimizing subjectivity when needed to mitigate opportunities for gaming. So we already discussed this, but in the determination of harvest intensity, there's 3 different approaches allowed. One option is to leverage a pre-existing forest management plan. Since these plans are pre-existing, they're completely property specific. This specificity adds precision to baseline setting for a particular project. But not every landowner is going to have a pre-existing forest management plan, and we don't allow it to be created for the purpose of the carbon project, hence the need for options. So we also allow for a comparable properties analysis. Here, there's very little room for subjectivity. To the extent possible, publicly available data sets were specified, detailed steps were prescribed, and while there's, it's a complex geospatial analysis requiring lots of calibration, once it is calibrated, it should produce consistent results.
Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Kurt, What do you expect is the anticipated appetite of financial investors and landowners in using the ACR dynamic baseline?
Uh, I think the appetite is very high, based on the number of participants here, based upon what we've already, a lot of the communications we've already got from folks that already work within our program and those that already don't, or that don't. So we're very optimistic about this new iteration of IFM 2.1. We've already got a lot of listings for IFM 2.1 and indication that a lot of our older projects may be transitioning to use the newer version of the methodology, or also a lot of interest in the new tool that we're developing for updating components of previous projects to the IFM 2.1 dynamic baseline framework. So we're excited, and yeah.
Thank you. Andy, how are changes in timber pricing accounted for on an annual basis under dynamic baselines?
Okay. This is a really great question and illuminates the challenge of balancing practicality with precision. So we know that timber prices change constantly, and stumpage price reports, which is what most projects utilize, they're published on an annual basis. And when optimizing a harvest schedule, even slight changes in the inputs, like the timber prices, may produce a different end result. But we didn't want the methodology to require baselines to be remodeled for insignificant changes just for the sake of being dynamic. So we set up two tests when evaluating whether timber price changes required a dynamic adjustment. The first test is, did any baseline harvest tip from financially feasible to financially infeasible? If so, that harvest has to be excluded and the carbon accounting needs to be adjusted. So this is the bright red line that cannot be crossed. It's the more obvious of the two tests. But second, we wanted to capture a more nuanced change in timber prices. So the second test is, the timber prices change significantly, and we define significantly as greater than 25%. So if the project's average timber price, weighted by species across the project, changes more than 25%, the baseline has to be adjusted prior to credit issuance. And that's even if all of your harvests are still revenue positive.
Thank you. Kurt, how is regional market capacity and harvest intensity implemented as it relates to the dynamic baseline?
So regional timber market capacity is quantified by examining mills in financially feasible hauling distances and summing their available capacity to calculate a total market capacity specific to the project based on its location. And the timber output from the baseline then can never exceed this total market capacity for any given single year of the baseline. So in terms of a dynamic baseline in that aspect, if either the number of mills within a financially feasible hauling distances or their capacities change during the reporting period, a project needs to demonstrate that the timber market output for that reporting period doesn't exceed the new total timber market capacity. If it does exceed it, adjustments would be necessary to avoid overcrediting. But if not, the baseline doesn't require an update. And that's, as far as harvest intensity, the premise is similar. If comparable properties approach were to show that the baseline is exceeding the maximum harvest intensity threshold based on what's actually occurring on the landscape on other properties that are similar but aren't enrolled in carbon projects, the baseline would need to be revisited and revised as appropriate to not exceed that threshold. But if not, again, the baseline could proceed as is. And this is coming back to, incentivizing realistic and conservative baselines that align with common practice forestry for the region and ownership type, such that we think development and verification would be able to go smoothly.
Thank you. Andy, can the dynamic baseline only be adjusted to be more conservative? Is there a scenario where the baseline would be changed to harvest more?
Yeah, so a dynamically adjusted baseline can result in either more or less harvesting than predicted by the most recent ex-ante projections. We certainly anticipate that for the most part, adjustments will be in the conservative direction, but in instances where robust evidence is provided, we're really okay, and we think it's justified that dynamic changes result in increased harvesting. Some example scenarios where this might happen would be when timber prices significantly increase in the region. And if this happens, we really do anticipate increased harvesting from landowners, and the baseline should be reflective of that. Another example is when a new mill opens, maybe it provides new opportunities for different species that wasn't available to the landowner previously. Also, if a comparable properties analysis reveals that similar landowners are increasing their harvesting compared to the last comparable properties analysis, then the harvest intensity constraint would be more aggressive, and the baseline could reflect that. Legal constraints are a little different. We generally expect them to always trend conservatively over time. That's not necessarily guaranteed either, but that is I think, everybody's expectation. But the economic constraints are certainly more fluid. Lastly, I'll also just note that for projects wishing to minimize disruption and the number of baseline remodels, dynamically discovered changes which lead to increased harvesting, so a not conservative type of change, they're not required to be incorporated. Projects can always choose to implement a less aggressive baseline than the allowable upper limit. And this flexibility should make the dynamic evaluation more workable for verification.
Kurt, will a permanent conservation easement enacted in conjunction with an offset project or after the project is listed impact baseline scenarios for subsequent reporting periods due to the dynamic evaluation process?
This is a good question. We thought about it quite a bit and clarified in this new version of the methodology. What we had been implementing before is that conservation easements are basically narrow-defined legal constraints that we consider self-imposed, and self-imposed legal constraints are excluded from consideration of the dynamic evaluation if they explicitly acknowledge and reinforce the project activity. So this was a decision that we made based on the desire not to disincentivize actions that would reinforce the project permanence itself. And there's some nuance in the methodology, and that can be found by looking at the text as well. But that's the premise of easements.
Thank you. Andy, can you please elaborate on the requirements of how the baseline constraints from the comparable properties tool must be applied? The tool seems to suggest that it must be an acreage constraint specific to the stratification as defined by the tool.
Okay. The harvest intensity constraints derived from the comparable properties analysis. I'll just start off by saying it's not exactly an acreage constraint because of the formulation of the harvest intensity value, that equation that we looked at on some slide earlier. So it's an acreage per year multiplied by the percent biomass removed per acre. So it's a little bit different than just a pure area constraint. But moving beyond that point, this question asks if the constraint is specific to the stratification defined by the tool, and the answer to that is yes. The harvest intensity constraints from the comparable properties analysis, they're stratum specific. This tool utilizes the National Land Cover Database as its default stratification layer. And once a matched comparable property is selected, the harvest rates derived from that property are applied to the baseline specifically to each stratum within the project. The strata that we expect to see in most IFM projects are hardwood forests, conifer forests, mixed forests, and woody wetlands.
Kurt, what is the point of the NPV analysis if harvest intensity already sets a maximum baseline harvest level?
Yeah, we got a few questions about this, and this is a good one. So the NPV financial analysis portion of the ACR baseline approach, which would be familiar with all the users of the earlier versions of the methodology, is still required in addition to the comparable properties analysis because it helps to ensure that the baselines are precise and project specific. So essentially, the output of the comparable properties analysis is enacted as a model constraint, which we termed harvest intensity. The NPV financial analysis considers harvest intensity as well as all the other constraints in creating the baseline harvest schedule. So the addition of harvest intensity doesn't fundamentally change the ACR baselining approach, but rather it's another safeguard or constraint on baseline harvesting, ensuring that the harvest rate aligns with the actions of similar nearby landowners not enrolled in carbon projects. And it may present itself as a maximum volume removed per acre. The ownership-specific NPV discount rate that we have in previous versions of the methodology still is there as well. That's another safeguard on landowner intent to harvest, and it can affect the amount and the timing of baseline harvests over the project term. So NPV is still a key component to baseline setting, and I think a lot of the users of our methodology like the predictability and the systematic and objective approach of it. I'll note that version 2.1 now does not explicitly require the baseline to maximize NPV from timber, but rather this is treated as an upper limit for baseline harvests. So projects that may optionally, they may optionally use our ACR IFM framework, but to propose more conservative baselines when conditions or buyer preferences might fit.
Andy, does ACR have any plans to develop a GIS tool that performs the comparable properties analysis? This would make it more available for non-GIS specialist users.
Yeah, our team has been exploring that possibility of developing kind of like a geospatial tool that would be perhaps available online and widely available to the public, and would just make that complex geospatial process a little bit simpler for GIS users with less experience and expertise. But we don't have firm plans to complete this work yet. We're still in the process of finding partners for this project, determining our funding needs for it, making initial plans. So I'll just add that if any audience members are interested in learning more or contributing in any way, please do reach out to us.
Kurt, how does this version address concerns about baselines for NGOs and land trusts enrolling in carbon projects?
We've thought a lot about the various kinds of landowners that use our methodology. The comparable properties analysis tool requires landowners, including NGOs and land trusts, to set baseline harvesting based upon observed harvests occurring in the nearby vicinity within their same ownership class. So NGOs and land trusts can essentially only set baselines as conservative or as aggressive as similar ownerships that are actively and actually harvesting on the landscape. The forest management plan and removals only baseline options might present some additional and conservative approaches for NGOs and land trusts in setting their baselines as well. So, we think that the latest updates go far in providing assurance of the climate impact of IFM across the full range of organizations using the ACR methodology. And we think that the market will respond well to all the different types of projects that are produced under this methodology.
Andy, what are the implications, if any, for existing ACR projects developed under previous versions of the methodology?
Well, to start with, projects developed using a previous version of the methodology are only ever required to adhere to the version that was available at the time of their listing. So no old projects are going to be required to make any changes based on any future updates, including this one. Speaking more broadly, version 2.1 is simply the latest iteration of ACR's improved forest management methodology for the United States. ACR has increased the precision of the requirements for developing baseline scenarios, but the overall approach has not changed. As Kurt mentioned, we're just adding safeguards here to the existing framework. Credits verified under previous versions of the IFM methodology continue to represent verified emission reductions and removals. And I think it's important to remember that when it comes to climate action, sooner is better than later. So credits issued under previous versions reflect actions that took place sooner and according to the most up-to-date rules that were available at the time. Carbon markets are constantly evolving, and organizations that really value climate action should support those who took positive action, regardless of the methodology version that was available at the time. So devaluing previous good work does not incentivize the future progress needed to meet our collective climate ambitions. Also, ACR does plan to update the tools that are employed by IFM version 2.1 to allow their use and their adoption by projects developed using previous versions of the methodology, and also other ACR IFM methodologies like our Canada methodology.
Thanks, Andy. We're going to run right up to the top of the hour here, so we got time for a few more. How does ACR IFM manage concerns about leakage? Has the treatment changed in the latest version update?
Yeah, I can take that one. The approach to leakage has not changed from previous versions. So ACR continues to deduct for potential leakage using literature-based deductions applied to total issuance volumes. So applying a leakage percent to total issuance volume is the most conservative route you can take with the literature, which just provides percentages. And the current deduction based upon the literature out there that we have is 30% of total ERTs issued.
All right, I guess this one's going to be to you, Andy. I would be curious to learn if the dynamic evaluation is required for all users of the methodology, and if not, why not? In other words, could a developer choose not to use the dynamic evaluation?
No, a developer could not make that choice. So it is absolutely required for all projects developed under version 2.1 of the IFM methodology. The optionality that maybe we've referred to throughout the presentation here has been regarding older projects or just existing projects that were developed using previous versions of the methodology. Those projects are going to have the choice whether to update, and this is a choice that's always existed, whether to update to the most recent version of the methodology or not. But for all new projects developed using 2.1, they'll be required to dynamically evaluate.
Thank you. Kurt, regarding a robust forest inventory, there was a description of, quote, boots on the ground. Does this mean that forest inventories would need to be fully field-based, or would an inventory developed by a combination of remote sensing and field plot calibration / verification be acceptable?
Yeah. So our current version of the IFM methodology does require a field plot based inventory. It can leverage stratification, but requires a sampling intensity that meets a 10% confidence threshold. We are developing a remote sensing approval framework at the moment that is a separate endeavor. It will go through public comment and as well as peer review that may allow for more remote sense-based carbon estimates to be integrated into our program over time. We expect that to be coming probably in 2025. So we are exploring this, but for the moment, we do rely on field-based carbon estimates.
Andy, professional forester is a California concept. Outside of California, what are the credentials of foresters that would opine on appropriate silviculture?
That's a good question. There are other states that have licensing programs besides California for professional foresters, but without looking at the list, I think it's about 10 states or so that have something similar. So we do need to provide options for those other parts of the country that don't have laws like that. And we lean on the Society of American Foresters, their professional licensing program, as well as ACF, the Association of Consulting Foresters, I believe. And then we also put another requirement on individuals who are using one of those other programs to qualify as being a professional forester. They also have to have work experience in the region of the project. So it's a new rule in version 2.1.
With that, we're at the top of the hour. Thank you to those of you who stayed the full hour. And again, we know we got more questions than we had time to address. We addressed a lot of questions, but not all of them. We will be writing a follow-up blog post. And so here's a contact information if you have more follow-up to do. We certainly encourage you to visit our website. And with that, we'll just say thank you so much for joining us today.